Jared Poland, FroKnowsPhoto.com. Welcome to the Fronos Photo Beginner Guide. And what this guide is all about is getting you out of auto. I want to give you the very basic information that gets you out of auto so that you're not stuck there. Because if you're stuck there, you're wasting time. So we're going to hit the very basic information, keep it fun, keep it informative, because we like to have fun, and that's really it. So let's get right to it. All right, let's dive right into this. One of the most important things to remember as a photographer is the mentality of being a photographer. What do you want to do? Are you looking to just photograph your kids because it's a hobby? Are you looking to pick up something new because you've always had an interest in photography and now's the time to learn it? Or are you looking to possibly make money, make it a profession? There's nothing wrong with having in the mind that I want to make money as a professional photographer. Either direction or any direction that you go as a photographer is perfectly fine. And I'll also tell you that even if you start off as a hobbyist, you're going to find that people are going to come up to you and want you to take pictures for them. You may start off photographing your kids at the park. Then their friends may ask you, not the kids aren't going to ask you personally because they're 3 and 4 years old. They don't really speak very well, but their parents are going to see you as a photographer. They're going to want you to shoot their birthday parties, and you could make money off of that. And that money, it may not be the most amount in the world, but it could subsidize buying a new piece of lens. Passion plays a strong part. You should start off photographing what you're most passionate about. What are 3 things that you love? Well, we know that if you have a little baby, you love the baby. You have a passion for capturing images of them. If you love nature or you love sports, well, there's something else you could capture. Do you want to travel and shoot landscapes? All of these different things. So you really can shoot just about anything out there, and there's a way to make it work, whether you want to make money or whether you don't want to make money. So passion plays a strong part. And I'll say, I started off photographing sports. I was really passionate about that. Now I'm passionate about music. And now, because of all that, I take great pride in capturing great images of people. So I'm passionate about telling the story of people. So as we move through in this guide, always keep that in mind. What do you want to do as a photographer? What do you like to capture as a photographer? And where do you want to take it? So that's about it. Let's keep moving on. I know you're itching to pick up your camera and start shooting, but there's something we have to talk about before you even get there, and that's this. This is a slide mount. This is what would frame, say, your 35mm piece of film. Getting your framing and composition right is really what photography is about. There's a big difference between missing your composition and nailing it, between getting that image that really is the greatest image you've ever seen to the image that could have been. One of these, not this exact one, was given to me by one of my teachers in college, and she basically said, I want you to carry this around in your wallet, along with some other things. You should all carry extra things around in your wallet. I want you to think about composition and framing and seeing the world. This is a slide mount. I have these in my store, but you could also make this out of any piece of paper, a piece of cardboard. Just cut out a 35mm square. It's 2x3, that's the ratio, but just see the world. Look at it. If you want to zoom in, what do you think we do? We pull it out. So now I'm framing the subject. I'm zooming in. If you want to make it a wide angle, you pull it closer. So it becomes about seeing the world. If you learn to compose your image and see it, sometimes without the camera, when you pick up the camera, you're going to see the image before you even shoot it. That means you can anticipate it, you can capture the moment, and it makes photography that much better. Here, keep this in mind. We know that a lot of cameras shoot really fast. We know you can hold the shutter down and shoot 5, 6, 7 pictures in a row. Instead of just picking up the camera and spraying the world with photos, spray and pray as they call it, get one good one and move on. So see the world through this, and let's get moving on to the next thing. Let's start with the very basics. These are the foundations that you're going to take with you for your whole life as a photographer. And the very first thing is how to hold the camera. It is one of the most important things you're going to need to do because you have to be holding the camera when you're going to shoot it. So how do we do this? You put your right hand right here, and then you lock it in on the right-hand side of the camera. Where do we think the left hand goes? Well, it's going to go right underneath the camera. Why do we do this? Because one, it's very stable. And you're going to learn later on in this video that when you're more stable, it's going to allow you to get sharper images at slower shutter speeds. It just feels natural when you sit here and you rotate the lens just by using your thumb and forefinger. Some people hold the camera this way, and you may fall into that very early on. This isn't the way to hold the camera. If you're holding it like this, it's just not very stable. The whole point here is to be very stable when you're shooting photos. So there's a third thing that we do here. We've got the hand on the camera, we've got the left hand underneath. What do we do with the elbows? We tuck them in. When you tuck them in, you're creating a natural tripod. You've got 3 points of connection here, and this is very stable. I can just see that when I move, I am not shaking. So as you're going to learn in the future, this is going to help you shoot at slower shutter speeds, and we're going to get onto that further along in this video. But yeah, tuck the elbows in, get everything in nice and close, just like this, because if the elbows come out, I can instantly feel that the camera is not stable. So I tuck them in, we're good to go, we get it like that. Now let's go into shooting vertical, because you can't forget to shoot your camera vertical. Most of you won't have a vertical shutter release, it allows you to shoot like this. So you have to reach your hand over the top of this. I'm not a fan of shooting under. I don't know, under just feels weird on the wrist, and it's going to feel weird no matter what. So you turn the camera vertical, the right hand comes right here, you can put it right on the shutter release button, your left hand comes back underneath. You can rotate the lens the same way with the thumb and the forefinger, and you can tuck your elbows in just as well. And you're creating basically that natural tripod. So here it is one more time really quick. Right hand locked in, left hand underneath, elbows tucked in, you're good to go, and let's move on. Moving into another basic technique that you're going to want to get used to, and that's changing lenses. Some of you guys will have one lens, which means you're not really going to have to change it or ever take it off the camera until you progress and pick up other lenses. But some of you will have multiple lenses when you just get started. So how do we change lenses? What are some techniques for changing the lenses? First things first is you always want to turn off the camera. The reason you turn off the camera is because now you have no power going to the image sensor. If you have power going to the sensor, you have a possibility of drawing dust and dirt into the camera because of static. So we turn the camera off. How do we take the lens off? Well, you press the button on the side of the camera. You'll see a lens release button. Depending on which camera you have will depend on which way your lens rotates. In this case, the Nikon one's going away from me. So one thing I wanted to do is you want to have the lens cap on because you want to put it face down. Boom. I take it off. I press the button. I rotate it. I take the one lens, put the cap back on the other. Line up the dots. In this case, I've got white dots. Some cameras will have red dots. We line them up. You listen for that click, and then you know that your camera and lens have seated together properly. It's all about that click. So some of you will be outside when you're making these lens changes. Don't be afraid to change your lenses and change them often. I change lenses often because I've got 9 different lenses that I can rotate through on a photo shoot. I don't always have them with me, but sometimes it's windy outside. And if it's windy, here's the best tips for changing your lenses. Well, you could go sit in a car if you really wanted, if you had a car around, but if you're just out in the wide open, have the wind to your back. Use your body as a natural windscreen. So here, the wind is blowing at my back. You can see the hair moving, woo, and then the wind is blowing, boom. I'm now blocking the wind with my body. I keep the camera tilted down. The reason I keep the camera tilted down when I'm changing lenses is because if there's dust, it's going to probably fall out. We're going to talk about gravity. It's simple. Gravity, dust falls out. We do this quick. We put on the other lens cap, the rear cap, camera's down, line up the dots, turn, lock. You're good to go with changing your lenses. So it's pretty simple. You're going to do this a lot. Don't be afraid to change your lenses. It's more important to get the photo than to worry too much about, is dust going to get into my camera? But remember, turn the camera off before you change lenses. Rotate, listen for that click, and you're good to go and moving on. To go along with changing lenses, there's some things that you may want to know. One, when you're cleaning the camera, do not use compressed air or canned air inside this camera. Because what could happen is the chemicals may end up finding a way onto the image sensor, and that may cause some, smudging, and you may have to send the camera back into whoever your camera manufacturer is to have cleaned, or give it to somebody who knows what they're doing when it comes to professionally cleaning your image sensor. You never want to touch the image sensor physically. You don't want to put your finger on it. You don't want to put non-approved materials that are meant to clean your sensor on there. And also, you never want to touch the mirror. What happens is the mirror flips out of the way and it's balanced properly in the camera. And if you knock that out of balance, then your camera's not going to work. The mirror won't flip, or it will get in the way of the photo, so you don't ever want to touch the mirror. With that said, you don't ever want to touch the image sensor either, unless you have proper education on how to clean it, or somebody professional is going to clean that as well. I don't clean my own image sensors usually. I send it out to Nikon to have them clean it in-house. So basically, remember, don't use compressed air or canned air inside the camera. Never touch the mirror, never touch the sensor, and just keep going from there. So we have another basic tip, and it's battery care. Proper ways to charge your battery, things to think about when you're going out on a photo shoot or before you have a photo shoot. So you have a battery in your camera. It's pretty simple. This is a lithium-ion battery. Most of them go in the same way. They're all going to go in the bottom. But there's some basic techniques that you can use to make sure your battery is going to last longer and live longer. What do you want to think about? Well, if your battery is fully charged, you really have nothing to worry about. I like to have my battery fully charged before a photo shoot. The reason is you never know when you're going to need more power. Even if you're just going out to shoot and you think it's going to be a short day, what happens if you start doing some video or you have a lot of photos to shoot? You don't want to run out of battery power, because if your battery dies on a shoot, you're not going to get any photos, and you're not really going to get asked back to do a job, or you're just going to miss everything that you needed. So what do you want to think about? Remember that the batteries are lithium batteries. They're rechargeable. They're going to last a long time. But proper techniques are, if you're going to charge it, it's going to take an hour or two to fully charge. I recommend not leaving it on the charger overnight for 2 days, for 4 days, for a week, for a month, because what's going to happen is the battery life is going to end up going down because it's constantly being charged, and then it's draining, and then it's being charged, and that's going to lessen the life of your battery. So before a photo shoot or the day before, you want to make sure your battery's charged. You want to make sure it's back in the camera before you leave. And it's really important to have an extra second battery, because you never know when something's going to happen to your first one. It may just stop working. You don't know when this stuff's going to happen, because it's not a matter of if something happens, it's a matter of when. Because something is going to happen one of these days, and you want to be prepared. So that's why we have a second battery, just in case something happens to the first thing that's totally out of whack. So moving on. All right, we're really close to getting ready to shoot. Let me tell you what I'm shooting with. Now, it doesn't matter what you have. We're going to talk about the lens, the camera. I have a Nikon D3100 here. It could be any camera in the world, and I could shoot with it as long as I'm not eating bugs, which are protein. But I could shoot with just about any camera you hand me. The lenses are really important. So in this case, I'm using a 35mm 1.8. It's a fixed focal length lens. And what that means is that it's not a zoom. In order to zoom, I have to actually move my feet. I have to go forward, I have to go backwards, because it's not zooming. Many of you are going to have zooming lenses. What I'd like you to do is pick a spot in the zoom range, probably somewhere in the middle, and just leave it there for the shooting, for all of your test shots, because that's going to force you to move your feet. If you can get into the habit of moving your feet, and instead of zooming in on everything or zooming out on everything and actually getting closer to your subject, or seeing the frame and filling the frame, then you don't really, you'll see that zooming isn't the end-all be-all. It will make framing easier when you are locked to one focal length. One thing I want to mention, when you're trying this out, we haven't gotten into settings for your cameras. We haven't talked about aperture, shutter speed, and all that. I know we're going to get you out of auto, but this is about getting the rules and getting the composition down before we worry about the settings and the exposures and tweaking those. Because if you can get your composition proper, then everything else will follow. Because it's okay to have the greatest image in the world, but the exposure and everything is off. But if I can still see that you got that image, that's really important. But for now, for learning the composition, it's okay to stay in auto, because we're just worrying about what your image looks like in terms of framing, composition, and following the rules. So be sure to do that, or stay doing that. And now we're going to move on and start shooting the rest of the rules of composition. So we've hit a lot of the basics, but now it's time to get into something extremely important, which is composition. That's what makes your image interesting, or creates tension, or makes somebody like it versus not liking it, even though it's subjective. But composition, there's a lot of different rules, and we're going to get into those rules as we go forward. But I just want to tell you how important it is to listen to these rules when you're first starting out. It's okay to break rules. But in order to break the rules, you have to learn them first. And that's what we're going to do. I'm just going to intro you a little bit about each of the rules that I find to be the most important and show you some examples while we're doing the discussion. So let's move right into rule of thirds. You hear a lot of people talking about rule of thirds. What is it? Well, generally you throw a subject off to one side of the frame or the other. If you look at a frame, you can break it off into three sections. You have your left, your center, and your right. And depending on where you put in the person in the image, they could be looking into the frame. They could be looking out of the frame. Their hand could be going across it. So there's a lot of different things that you can do with rule of thirds in terms of composition that can make your image stronger. Whereas a subject may not look great right in the middle of the frame, they may look even better if you put them off to the left side of the frame and create some extra interest, or possibly create some tension where they're off to the left-hand side and they're looking out of the frame. So rule of thirds is one of those that you'll hear a lot about, or you'll see a lot of people do when they're out shooting. It's something that I use quite often, especially when shooting different subjects, say sitting on a park bench, for example. If you put them in the middle of the bench, it may not be as interesting as if you put them off to the left side or the right side of the bench. So it's pretty simple. Just follow it, just think about it, and when you're out there seeing it, if you take a picture right in the middle, recompose it and throw them off to one of the sides. The next one I want to talk about is leading lines. These are lines that draw you into an image, that draw you out of an image, or create interest. For example, you have something like a long driveway. It's long and winding, and then you just shoot it in whatever way that you would like, and your eye flows through the image. Or what I was talking about with rule of thirds, if you put somebody off to the left-hand side and their eyes were leading into the frame, then you're using two forms of composition, two forms of the rules. You're using rule of thirds and leading lines to create interest. So if I'm sitting on one side of the frame and I'm looking to the other, my eyes are leading you into the frame. Or if you want to create some tension, they could be leading you out of the frame. So leading lines could be anything from using a railroad track. It could be anything from using a person pointing. It's as simple as somebody leading the eyes of the beholder, the eyes of the viewer into the frame, out of the frame, around the frame. It's what creates the interest when you're photographing. Leading lines. Now we're going to talk about framing. It's one of those compositions that is really interesting, and if you noticed, I'm sitting in a natural frame right now. I am in this egg chair, and the chair is creating a natural frame, which is creating interest in the image. It's drawing you in. So framing could be anything from a tree, could be a window frame, it could be a door frame, putting somebody in a doorway and having the natural frame of the doorway frame, for no better word, the person or the subject that you're photographing creates interest. It's a great rule of composition. So think of framing when you're walking around. Could it be a jungle gym? Could it be the metal pieces of that jungle gym framing a person in it? There's all of these different things. A ladder, if somebody's climbing up a ladder and then their head is framed by two of the rungs in the side of the ladder, that's framing. So what I'm trying to get you to do is see that all of these natural frames exist in our everyday world, and now you can go out there and capture it. It just creates interest in an image. It draws you in. It just makes it work really, really well. So that's framing. So let's talk about depth of field. This is one of those rules of composition that is going to separate you from a lot of other photographers out there. And you're going to see an example photo shoot of depth of field coming up a little later. But what I'm talking about is using your subject who's going to be sharply in focus and having an out of focus area in the background. You're using the depth of field that you created to draw you into a subject. And something that I like doing a lot is using an out of focus area in the foreground or in the background to draw you in, to draw the the person who's viewing your image to draw them into the frame. For example, if you have a drum set up and you've got cymbals and a person is standing behind it and you take a picture of them, they're in focus, but the cymbals are out of focus, creating a natural frame around them. Remember, you can use multiple rules together, and then using those out of focus symbols to draw you into the subject. This is one of the strongest compositions that I personally use. One of the strongest rules of composition that I use is out of focus areas to draw you in, and really using selective depth of field to create interest in your image. We're going to see more of this as we go forward, and I think you're really going to like this one. Have you ever seen those images where everything is even, left to right, top to bottom, side to side? That's symmetry. Everything is even. It looks good. And I know that we talked about rule of thirds and not putting things right in the center of an image. But with symmetry, if you have a building that has, two rows of windows on this side, 2 rows of windows on that side, and it goes all the way up, and you photograph it right in the middle, and it's even left to right, and it's even top to bottom. It's very symmetric. It creates interest in your images. So trying to find these images out there in the world, it's not that hard. But when you do find it, it creates a tremendous amount of interest for your images, and I find them to be extremely strong when you use symmetry in your images. So we've talked about a lot of rules of composition that create interest in images. There's something called mergers, which is something that you have to look out for. It's one of those rules of composition that, it's not something that you're trying to do. It's just something that you want to be cognizant of when you're photographing. For example, if there's a sign coming out of the side of somebody's head, there's a tree branch coming out of the top of somebody's head, you want to make sure that you recompose your image or move your subject before you photograph that. So a merger is anything that is a distraction in your image that takes away from the viewer. So like the person with a sign coming out of the back of their head, what could you do to make that better? Step to the side, move the subject, change your angle. That is something that is really important, is to make sure that you don't have mergers distracting your frame. So like I like to say, is always check the outside of your image. Check the viewfinder. Make sure there's something that's not protruding into the frame that shouldn't be there. Or make sure that if something is there, that it should be there and it's not interfering with your subject. There's something that you can do to create more interest in your image, and that's angles. Whether you're at a high angle, a low angle, or shooting right at eye level. Different angles will create different types of interest in your images. For example, if you're photographing kids, a great tip is to get down on their angle. Because if you're shooting them standing straight up, or you're shooting an animal and you're standing straight up and you're shooting them straight down, it's not going to look interesting. It's going to look like an amateur snapshot. So if you get down on that level, you're going to create more interest in your frame because the subject's going to look better, and it's just going to look more like a really cool image. So angles are extremely important when getting your images to have interest. So as you can see, there's a lot of different rules of composition. I really would like you to learn them, try them, practice them before you try to break the rules. Now, it's okay to break the rules. There's nothing wrong with breaking the rules, but I think that it's more important that you learn them first before you get into breaking them. So go out there and try each form of these compositions. Go through some of the images that you may already have taken, or look at other people's work and go, oh, that's rule of thirds, or that combines rule of thirds with leading lines. Because like I said, you can combine different rules to make an image even more interesting. You're going to see this. You're going to see leading lines and symmetry and rules of thirds. You're going to see a lot of these things in the images that you're finding out there in magazines, movies, TV, and hanging on some of your friends' walls. So composition, very important thing to learn and to work on. So definitely go out there and try these different rules for yourself. Do you know how I talk about mentality and how important it is to think as a photographer? Well, there's something that is really, really important to keep in mind, and that's cropping. There's a lot of people, you may not understand what cropping is. What is it? Well, it's when you take a picture and then later on in post-production or in the computer, you decide that you don't like the composition or the framing, so you cut down on the image, you move it to where it should have been when you were actually taking the picture. This goes back to filling the frame with that slide mount that I showed you for seeing the world. I say that I crop in camera, not in the darkroom. That was something that my teacher in high school taught me. Crop in the camera, not in the darkroom, and you make your life a heck of a lot easier. You get better quality images, you save a lot of time, and that was when we were shooting film. So I will say, when I say crop in the camera, I don't mean literally use the crop tool that some of these cameras have built into them. I just mean don't crop after the fact in post-production. If you need to fill the frame with the subject's head for a vertical portrait, well, don't shoot it wide and then go and crop it later, because you're creating more work and you're also going to create lesser quality images. You move your feet, you zoom in, you fill the frame. Constantly think about filling the frame, anticipating the moment. Anticipate what lens you should have on the camera so that you're not, having the wrong lens on. You have an ultra wide angle when you're shooting something that should be telephoto, and then you're forced to crop later. It just feels better not to crop later. To get the composition right, to feel the moment, to anticipate it, to know what lens to have on, to know what focal length to be at, just to get that right is really, really good. And here's some reasons for not cropping later. I've heard shoot wide, crop later. That's just one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. I'll just say that right now. The reasons we don't do that, one, it feels great to be able to fill the frame, capture it, and know that you were able to do it without cropping. Two, as you start cropping in post-production, you're losing quality in your images. You're cutting back on megapixels. People always say, well, there's too much grain, there's too much noise, Jared. How do you not have so much grain in your images? Well, when I'm shooting at higher ISOs, I am not cropping. And that's one of the things that affects how you see noise and how you see grains. So just by not cropping, you're just using all the data that you have. As you start to crop, you're losing data. It's not good. So just the whole moral of this story is fill the frame as much as possible in the camera. And I'll also say, study the ones that you miss. Study your compositions. Sit in the computer and use that to your advantage. Take a picture that you are editing and go, how should I have cropped this in the camera? And then try to replicate that in the future. So use those mistakes, we'll call them little happy mistakes, little happy mistakes to then get it right in the future. So learn from that, keep going, have fun, shoot, fill the frame, don't crop as much as possible. That's just my suggestion. Now let's take a look at the camera and figure out what the modes mean that you could possibly be in. And on the camera, you've got those modes like the running man and the good-looking girl and the mountain and the night portraits. We're never going to touch those modes. I mean, I shouldn't say never, but most likely you are not going to want to use those modes once you fully understand what the other modes are that most professionals use and most photographers really stay in. There's 4 modes that I'm going to discuss in more detail because those are the modes that most people end up staying in. You've got your P, S, A, and M, program, shutter priority, aperture priority, and manual. So now let's move into explaining what the pros and cons are of each of them and which ones that I like to stay in myself. Let's start by looking at program mode. We'll start with this one first because it's probably one of the least important of all of the modes that are on this end of the dial. Program mode basically is auto. It's going to set just about everything for you, but allow you to make some tweaks in the camera to some of your settings that you wouldn't be able to do if you were in that green mode or the square mode or whatever mode is full automatic. So program is going to go and set the shutter speed for you. It's going to set your aperture for you, and then you just have to go and take pictures. So the pros and cons to program mode, I don't think there's too many pros other than it's going to automatically set everything for you to give you the proper exposure. So I don't think I've ever used the program mode personally myself. The cons, it's going to set everything for you, and you're not really spreading your wings and starting to fly. You're letting the camera do all the work. So as you go around the dial, you come up to the S mode, or in some cameras, the TV mode. They call it TV. We'll break it down simply. You are going to set your shutter speed, and the camera is going to go ahead and automatically set the aperture. You've already set your ISO, you've picked it to where you want it to be, but in this case, you set the shutter speed to where you want it. Now, where does this come in handy? If you want to have a specific shutter speed that you don't want to drop below. So you don't want to go below 250th of a second because you want to capture motion and you just want to keep it right there. You're going to set it at 250th of a second, and the camera is going to then go ahead and set your aperture to compensate to give you the right exposure. So shutter priority is another one of those modes that I've rarely ever gone into. If I'm shooting sports and I see that it's dropped to a certain point, I definitely want to then go ahead and put it to where I want it. So I'll set my shutter speed to where I want it and then let the aperture go ahead and automatically be set by the camera. As we continue around the dial, we get to the aperture priority mode, which is A on some cameras and it's AV on other cameras. Now this is where I've made my living starting out as a photographer. I stayed in aperture priority mode for a long time until I was able to spread my wings and expand into the manual settings. But what is aperture priority? You set your aperture, just like shutter priority, you set your aperture here, and then it's going to automatically set your shutter speed this time. So, that's really a good thing. When you're controlling your f-stop or aperture, you're in charge of the depth of field, and you can control what's in focus and what's out of focus. And to me, that's more important than if you control your own shutter speed. So that's why I made a living or stayed in aperture priority for a long, long time. Many of you guys, I recommend that you start in aperture priority mode. Once you get out of, basic auto, stay away from program, I think you'll like aperture priority. But you have to remember that in these modes, you're always going to be looking at the other settings to see if they're in the right place. One of the cons of shooting with aperture priority is that you have to really keep an eye on your shutter speed, because if your shutter speed's dropping too slow, then there's other things that you need to do inside the camera in order to make your exposure proper. So you really have to pay attention to those other settings. Now we're on to the main setting, the setting that I used the most, which is manual. It's just going to be an M on your camera. Why do I live in this setting? Well, because I have full control over everything that I want. I control the shutter speed. I control the aperture. I'm always setting my ISO. So manual is what you guys should aspire to get to. It's okay to start in that aperture priority mode or, really aperture priority mode, but your goal should be to learn how to get out of that mode and fully take control of what your camera offers you, because you're smarter than the camera. Now, what I'll say is there is a way to get into manual pretty easy, and that's using an auto mode like aperture priority and looking at those settings and then replicating that in manual. So if it said, the shutter speed should be 1/250th of a second at f4 in aperture priority, then you go into manual and say you do the same exact thing. And this isn't something that you're going to get right off the bat, but I do suggest that you try to shoot in manual so that you can see what happens. It's all cause and effect. If I do this, this is going to happen. If I do that, that's going to happen. So as you start to learn this, I don't think anybody ever fully masters everything, but I think, manual exposure is something that you will get very, very strong with, in the years to come, that will allow you to literally sit there and know that the light just changed and go, okay, I need to do this to my shutter speed, or I need to do this to my aperture. So those are things to keep in mind as you, start to progress as a photographer. So those are the different shooting modes that we go around the dial with. You have your manual, aperture priority, shutter priority, program mode, and we stay out of all of those funny little picture modes, because really the four that you're going to want to start to look at are the ones that I just said. So there you have it. Those are the modes. I like to stay in manual and aperture priority. My recommendation to you is to start in aperture priority and then switch your way off into manual and start to spread those wings and fly away just like this. Here we go. Let's get into shutter speed. The very basic information that I can hit on shutter speed, well, there's something in the back of the camera called your shutter that opens and closes. Think of it as when you blink your eyes, you go from no light to having light. So there is a lot of things that shutter speed affects. One thing it affects is, can you freeze motion? The faster a shutter speed, the more you're going to freeze the motion. The slower the shutter speed, as you're going to see a little later, is you're going to get some motion blur. But shutter speed also affects light. The slower the shutter speed, the more light you're letting in. The faster the shutter speed, the less light you're letting in. So let's look at the numbers that your shutter speed could go so you get familiar with what you're going to see in your camera. In this case, I'm going to start at, say, 1/10, which is 1/10 of a second, because this is 1/10 of a second. Boom. It's slow. You can hear it go chink, chink. Being that it's so slow, what do you think is going to happen to a subject that is moving? Well, at 1/10 of a second, because it's so slow, they are going to blur because they're going to move across the frame as the shutter goes like this. Bink, bink, instead of boom, boom. Opposed to, we'll dial it up to 1,000th of a second, and this is what you're going to hear. That's really fast. So motion, when something is running or jumping up and down, say your kid is running around the playground, you are going to want to know that if you see something that looks like 1/10 of a second in your camera, that the kid's probably going to blur. So how do we get that moved faster? Well, we move it up. So from 1/10 of a second, you can go to 1/13th. You see 1/15th, 1/20th, 1/25th, 1/30th of a second, and that's still slow. Let's get to 1/60th of a second. At 1/60th of a second, they kind of have a rule of thumb that says if you're hand holding and you're not on a tripod, you shouldn't hold it less than 1/60th of a second because you could get some motion blur. But as you bump that higher from 1/60th to, say, 1/25th, all the way up to 200th, 250th, 500th, the higher the number, the faster the shutter is going to open and close. But that also means that you're cutting down on the amount of light that you're letting in. And think of that. Think of what's going on there. A fast shutter speed is opening and closing. What's happening to the light? Is a lot of light getting in, or is a little light getting in? Well, at a really fast shutter speed, less light is getting in. At a very slow shutter speed, because it's open longer, more light is able to hit that image sensor. So now there's another rule of thumb to keep in mind. I have on here a 70-300 lens. The rule of thumb says that the longer your focal length, or when you're shooting with a longer focal length, you don't want your shutter speed to drop below your focal length. So if it's 300 millimeters, you don't want to drop your shutter speed below basically 1/320th of a second, because you may get some motion blur from your hands moving. Because the focal length, the light has to travel all the way through. You're getting some blur, shaking like this. So instead of just talking about how shutter speed works for capturing motion, let's actually go and show it to you by using the swing set. And we're going to start at a slow shutter speed and then try to figure out what we need to do to make the image nice and sharp to freeze that action. So let's go and do that. So now we're ready to photograph the swing here. I'm locking in on the tripod just so that I have something that's not moving, so that each image kind of stays similar. Right now I'm set to shutter priority, and that means that I'm setting the shutter speed and the camera is going to do the rest of the work to make sure that it's exposed properly. So I'm going to start at 1/10 of a second. Remember how slow that was? You could hear the sound of how slow that was when we were testing and letting you hear the different shutter speeds. Now let's see what happens when we move the swing and shoot it at 1/10 of a second. So I'm going to try to capture the swing at the very bottom. Boom. And as we look at the swing, you can see that it's kind of hard to see because it's actually blurring. It's blurring because the shutter is moving really slow and there is some motion to the swing. So we have to think, what do we need to do to freeze that swing that is moving? Let's try something a little faster, like 1/60th of a second. So now we're dialing to 1/60th. There we go. And let's see what we got. No, there's still blur there. And we don't want that. We want to freeze the kid that's on this swing set. So how do we do this? We need to go even faster. So let's take it up to 1,000th of a second. You're going to see it as 1/1000. That's a fast shutter speed. It should freeze the swing set in its tracks. So now we're going to try and freeze this right at the bottom. Boom. Got it. And I could see in this one that before the shutter, it opens and closes. When you're looking through the camera, you see that it blacks out for 1 second, for a split second, or as long as your shutter's open. Well, in this case, by the time the shutter opened back up, the swing was kind of in the same place, and it is a frozen image. The swing is frozen in place because 1,000th of a second is pretty darn fast to freeze this swing set, which isn't moving terribly too fast. It's just moving. Put this into a real world environment. We're shooting a kid that is on the swing. Do we want a slow shutter speed where the kid's going to blur and you're not even going to see them? No. You're going to want a faster shutter speed, which means we're going to freeze the action and freeze the kid on the swing smiling and having a great time. So moving on. Now I want to talk about shutter speed and overexposing and underexposing. It's very important to visually see this, and it's not that hard these days to get it on the back of your camera to see what is overexposed, meaning it's too bright, underexposed is too dark, and then they're properly exposed right in the middle, obviously. So to do this, it doesn't matter what your ISO and aperture are set at right now. I would just put them right in the middle somewhere, maybe 200 and maybe at f5.6, just for trial and error, because we're talking about shutter speed. I have a scene behind me, which is a soccer net. We've got an open field. We've got a nice sky. We have nice colored grass. And what I'm going to try to do here is guess the setting for the shutter speed to see if I am right or wrong. In this case, I want to overexpose it. I want it to be wrong. I'm going to start at 1/60th of a second, and I feel that it's going to be too bright, but that's what we're going to do just to get a sample and an example of this shot. That's 1/60th of a second. And you can see that the image is blown out. And when I say blown out, if you're looking at the back of your screen and you see a bunch of blinky things, that means there's no detail left in the frame, and you didn't record any detail, so that's overexposed. This image is way overexposed. All you have are some greens and a lot of no detail in the scene. So how do we get to a properly exposed image from 1/60th of a second? Which direction do we need to go if it's overexposed? Well, we need to go up higher. We need to bump the shutter speed to cut back on the amount of light that's coming in. Too much light's coming in. We need to go back up to get less light coming in. And to do that, I will take my shutter speed up even higher and try it out at, let's go to 2/50th of a second for now and see if that gets us any closer. I take that, and that is much better. You got the trees, you have the grass, you've got the goal, the net, you've got everything in there, and it looks like it's a better exposure. And I'll say that every screen is different. They're not the most exact representations of your scene, but for the time being, we're not going to touch the meter in the camera, which you could look at to get your scene right. We're going to worry about the screen for now, just for this exercise, just to get a visual representation of what the frame is looking like. So 2/50th was still underexposed. Let's go to 1,000th of a second and see what this looks like. So there's 1,000th, and it's exposed even better. Based on what I'm looking at right now, it's a really nice looking image. You've got nice color, you've got the nice grass, the trees are nice in the background, and it looks really good. So now we've gotten a better exposure. We started off guessing the settings and we were wrong. It was way, way overexposed, and then we've now corrected by bumping our shutter up twice to 2 different shutter speeds to bring the image into more of a place that is representative of what I'm actually looking at. I don't see any blinky blinks on my screen. It looks to be properly exposed based on looking at this back of the screen, and it's just a much thicker image. The colors look great. The sky looks great. It's not the greatest scene in the world, but it's just for, sample purposes. Now, if you were to look at a scene and bump this up to, say, 3/20th, 1/3200th of a second, we know that's going to be underexposed, but I want you to see what that's going to look like. And at 1/3200th, it almost looks like it's a nighttime photo. It's just very dark. You can barely see the sky. You can barely see the colors. It's just gone. The shutter speed is too fast. It's not letting in enough light to make the image properly exposed. So what you've seen here is we've gone from overexposed, which is way too bright, to almost exposed properly, to then something that looks like it's really exposed properly, and then I showed you what underexposed looks like, which is way dark. So what's going on here is we're utilizing the shutter speed to basically get your scene right. We're changing it, whether it's underexposed or overexposed, to then find the properly exposed image. So what I want you guys to do for an assignment, this is two-part. We worked on the swings. I want you guys to shoot something that's moving, whether it's cars going by, whether it's somebody running. I want you to set your shutter speed slow, and then dial it in, say, at 1/10 of a second, and then work your way all the way up to, say, 1/4000th of a second, just to see how motion is captured at different speeds and different shutter speeds. That's really important. So sit there and try that out on your own. That's that first part of the assignment. The second part is to now guess a setting to work on underexposed versus overexposed, and just start overexposed. You want it to be really bright, so start at 1/10 of a second. And then dial your way through all the way up to, say, 1/4000th of a second again, and just get a feel for what overexposed looks like and what underexposed looks like. And that's about it. So, let's move on. So now we're ready to hit another piece of the exposure triangle, and that's ISO. So to break it down as simple as I really can, ISO is how sensitive your image sensor is to light. The lower the number, the less sensitive it is to light. The higher the number, the more sensitive it is to light. So if you think back to film days, for those of you who shot film, when you were going to buy it, you had 100, you had 200, you had 400, you had 800. So each one is used in a different situation. When you have more light, people like to say they want to use a lower ISO of, say, 100. If you don't have a lot of light, you can bump your ISO up higher. But being that we have a camera right here, why don't I run through what ISOs it offers? This camera can go from 100 ISO all the way up to 6400 ISO. So there's a huge span. It's where basically film never got to because it just looked so bad. It all depends upon your situation. So we're going to try to go through some scenes to learn where your ISO could be, where a good starting point is. When you're shooting fast-moving things, you know that you need more light, so you may need to bump your ISO up higher to get a faster shutter speed. If you want to bump it down lower, then you may not be shooting subjects. You may be doing something more like a landscape. But there's a difference between 100 ISO and, say, 6400 ISO. The differences are film grain or noise. In this case, it's digital noise because it's not film. The lower the number, the smaller the pixels are that gather the light, so it's much smaller. When you're at a higher ISO, say 1600, the pixels and the grains get larger, so they're able to gather light much quicker. But because they're so large, that's how you start to introduce some noise and some grain into your images. So it doesn't always mean that you should shoot at a lower ISO or a higher ISO. It depends on your situation. But know that, in order to get a faster shutter speed, you're going to bump your ISO up higher. Or to get a slower shutter speed, you're dropping your ISO. So you want to keep that in mind when you're shooting a subject. So if you know that you're going to be shooting an athlete or sports, you know that you need a faster shutter speed. So the way to do that right off the bat is to start at a higher ISO. Why start at a lower one if you already know that the shutter speed is going to be too slow? So keep that in mind, that each one is tied together. ISO is tied with shutter speed. So one thing's going to affect the other. In this case, ISO is directly affecting what's going to happen with your shutter speed. So you have to keep in mind what your subject is that you're shooting and where or how much light you need to let in. The more light you have, what do you know? The shutter speed is going to be faster. The less light you have, you're going to have a slower shutter speed. So that's really simple. Keep it in mind, and let's move on. Now we're going to get right into aperture, and to break it down as simple as I really can, think of it like your eyeball. When you walk into a dark situation, what happens to the pupil of your eye? It gets wider because it needs to let in more light. So when you're letting in more light, the pupil gets larger. As you get into the sun or you go outside, it gets smaller. So what's happening there? You're cutting back on light. So one of the major things that aperture affects is how much light is getting into the camera. But the other major part of your f-stop and aperture is depth of field. So that's basically controlled the same way. As the iris gets larger or smaller, things change in terms of focus. Your depth of field changes. You can control everything from the foreground to the background being in focus or out of focus, which is going to play a major part in your photography. How do you think of this? You've got your f-stop range. Some lenses open up. When I say open up, they let in more light. They get open to 1.2. And then there's things like f2, or so you have 1.4, then f2, then 2.8, 4, 5.6, f8, f11, f16, 22, and you can go beyond that in certain lenses. But the smaller the number, think of it like you're getting into a dark situation, the larger the opening is going to be. So at 1.2, the opening is as wide as it can be. You can look right through and see all of the light, all of the light pouring through. On the other end, you could be at f22. Think of it as this: the larger the number, the smaller the aperture is going to be. That's really small, and then all the way open, we're letting in a lot of light. So I hope that that makes a lot of sense, because it's pretty simple, but aperture is one of my most important things that I work with. Depth of field and aperture, controlling my light and controlling my depth of field is what sets me apart and makes some of my images really, really impactful sometimes. So that's about it. Let's move on to the next thing so you can start learning this. So you just heard me talk about f-stops. You heard me talk about how depth of field works. And now the best way to show you how that really, really works is to do this right here with this frog, who I've become well acquainted to. But what does it actually look like when you get a picture at 1.8 versus a picture at 22? What's going on here? Well, what's going on is that your depth of field is changing. A shallow depth of field is what you see when you're shooting at 1.8. It's very narrow. So your focus point, or your area of focus, is very small. As the numbers go up, all the way here to 22, your focus is changing. So more things are going to be in focus from front to back. So that's important to keep in mind. So what we're doing here is I'm going to photograph the frog, and I'm going to focus in on its eye at 1.8. And then I'm going to work my way all the way up to 22 so that you can see what's happening to the background. Then we're going to talk about it and figure out, the little subtleties that are going on. So right now I have the camera set to aperture priority. But aperture priority means that I am setting my aperture. I'm picking where I want it. And the camera is then going to select the shutter speed for a proper exposure. Let's shoot at 1.8. So I'm at 1.8 right now. I'm focused in on the frog's eye. Boom. That's 1.8. Let's take it to f2.8. Boom. Basically, I am going up one stop each time. It's called a stop of light. Every time you open up a stop, you're letting more light in. Every time you close down to a higher number, and you're letting in less light. So keep that in mind. We just shot one at 4. Now we're going to 5.6. There's that. f8. And I'm also going to tell you what's going on the whole time as I am raising my aperture. f11, 16, and now we're going to get to 22. So we went from 1.8, which you can see the background is extremely blown out, which is great. I love blowing out the background. They call it bokeh or bokeh, depending on where you are in the world. And that's the out of focus area. But it's really important to focus in on your subject and let the background blow out. So as we go from 1.8 to say 22, there's more in focus. Remember how I said from front to back, everything expands? Your depth of field changes. So that's what's happening here. We went from 1.8 to f22, but something else is also happening. The aperture is controlling or affecting the shutter speed. I'm sitting here watching the screen. We went from 1/4000th of a second, which is a really fast shutter speed, and at 1.8, and when we got to f22, it was down to, what is it right now? It is down to a 25th of a second. Keep in mind that as the apertures go up, you're cutting back on light. So you have to keep your shutter speed open for longer. So that's it for that. We just finished photographing the frog using a fixed focal length 35mm lens. And what does fixed focal length mean? That means that it doesn't zoom. The opposite of that is a zoom lens. You have something like this, which is an 18 to 55. So literally we zoom from 18, which is wide, to 55, which is a little further zoomed in. And also, I have here a 70 to 300 millimeter lens. Now, why am I showing you this? Because I'm going to photograph the frog again. I want to photograph the frog to show you the difference between trying to blow out the background with a wide angle versus blowing it out with a telephoto lens like the 70 to 300. Telephoto means it's zoomed all the way out. It's a much tighter frame that you're photographing. The difference when you're shooting wide angle, you're expanding the background. It's expanding. It makes it harder to actually blow the background out or separate your subject from it unless you get really close. If you use a longer lens, like this 70 to 300, and you zoom out to 300, you're compressing the background. You're separating your subject from the background. So focal length also plays a role with your depth of field. So not only does the aperture affect that, but depth of field is controlled with your focal length, and depending on how close you are to your subject, and also where you focus. So what I want to do now is go back to the frog and run through these lenses and show you how hard it is to make the background blow out using an 18 to 55, and how much easier it is to make it blow out using a 70 to 300. So let's go and do that now. So here's what we have. I'm set up ready to shoot the frog. I've got the 18 to 55 lens on the camera first, and I'm going to move to the 70 to 300. What I'm trying to get across here is that I am not going to move where this tripod sits. I'm not changing the distance to the frog. Remember, distance does affect depth of field. So we're going to start at 18. I'm in aperture priority still, and I'm at 5.6. So now I take that picture at 18 and I see, well, you can see that the background's not blown out. It's a wide angle shot. The whole frog is in there. There's not much blown out, and that's that. Now I'm just going to zoom. I'll go to 35 millimeters. The only thing that I may change here is just the framing, the composition, just by moving the camera slightly. So here we go. Now where that's 35 millimeters, you can see a little bit of a dip. Well, obviously we're much closer, but the background isn't as sharp. It's not as clear. Now we're going all the way out to 55. Focused in on the frog, actually nice composition. And you can see, and we're filling the frame more with the frog. The background isn't as clear because we're starting to compress it as we zoom in with the 18 to 55. Now we're going to switch over to the 70 to 300 and try, well, we're going to do the same thing. So now I'm going to be back at 70. Here we go, 70, boom. Look at that. Now the background is blowing out even more. So we've stayed at the same distance, but what's happening is we're starting to compress the background. As the focal length goes up, we're compressing it more. So remember, where 18 was wide, there's not a lot of compression because it's expanding. And now as we zoom in, let's go to 100. Well, let's go to 135 I see on here. There's the frog. There's the background. It's blowing out even more. It's starting to fade away as we fill the frame. We're not even moving. Let's take it to 200. And now you can see, again, the background is starting to really fade away. And then finally, all the way out to 300, I'm just going to change the composition a little bit. Focus right on the mouth of the frog now. And you can see that the background is not recognizable. You can't really tell what's in the background. Where at 18, you could see everything. You knew exactly what it was. It may not have been as sharp could be if you were right on it, but you knew it was still a swing set. You still knew that, there was all this stuff on the ground. Now that we've shown 300, we've compressed the background. You can see 18 is wide, 300 is starting to move in tighter, and the background's blowing out. And all that we changed here was the focal length. So that should paint that picture that tells you that 18 is obviously much wider. 300 is showing you how, you're going to shoot much tighter and fill the frame and blow the background out. So hopefully that helped. Let's move on to the next thing. All right, so we're back here again with the frog. You just saw me photograph it with everything from an 18 to 55 all the way out to 300 using basically staying at 5.6, staying at the same distance. But remember how I said that it's hard to make things go out of focus in the background at 18? Well, I'm going to show you now how we can actually do that. It's about distance. Distance is going to play a major part in your depth of field. So the closer you get to your subject, even if you're shooting with a wider lens, the better opportunity you have to blow out the background. So let's get down here and shoot the frog at 18 and see what we've got. Boom. All right, so the background is still there. I still know that there's a jungle Jimmy thing back there. So now I'm gonna get even closer and see what happens. I'm still at 18. Boom. And yeah, now the benches are starting to blow out of focus. The jungle gym in the background is blowing out of focus. So right now you're getting it. Distance is affecting our depth of field. So let's get even closer. Boom. And now the background is almost totally blown out. How amazing is that? You're seeing that we've got really close. We can close focus at 18 millimeters, which is great. So we went from showing you we were further back with the 18 and everything was in focus. Now we got even closer with the 18. Just by changing our distance, we're affecting depth of field. So what is this telling us? As you get closer to your subject and fill the frame more, you're going to blow out the background more. But that really should sum it up for you. When it comes to wanting to control your depth of field, the closer you get to your subject, fill the frame, you're gonna have a better opportunity of blowing the background out, even with a variable aperture lens. So let's keep moving on, and let's talk about variable aperture lenses when we come right back. So you just heard me speak about variable aperture lenses. And what is that? Well, I figured I should explain it to you if I mentioned it. A lot of the lenses that you guys got with your camera are variable aperture. So that means that the aperture doesn't stay constant throughout the zoom range. So that means 18, it's at 1 f-stop, and when you zoom out to 55 or all the way through the range, the f-stop is changing the whole way. You're losing light as you zoom. Basically, the reason they do that, it keeps the lenses less expensive, because the more expensive glass, like this is a 70 to 200 fixed lens, meaning it's 2.8 all the way through. So at 70, it's 2.8, and at 200, it's 2.8. That's why it's so much larger, because it has a lot more glass in it. So basically your aperture is not changing with this. As you zoom, you're not losing any light. So really what's going on here, I just wanted to let you know that when you see the numbers changing, or if you're at 18 and you try to hit 3.5 and then you zoom out to 55 and you try to say, well, why won't my camera go to 3.5? I don't get it. Well, the reason it won't is because your lens is a variable aperture lens. So keep that in mind when you're shooting. There's nothing wrong with your camera. It's just the lens that you're using, and there's nothing wrong with it being a variable aperture lens when you're starting out. So here we go, moving on. Here we go to talk about the meter in the camera. What is this thing? I just want to give you the basics because that's what we're here to do. What is the meter that I am looking at? Well, when you look inside your camera, you're going to see a plus, you're going to see a minus, you're going to see a 0 right in the middle. Some of you guys have a needle. If you remember ever hearing somebody say, line up that needle between the plus and the minus, you're going to get the theoretical proper exposure. So what we're talking about here are exposure modes, the different modes that you can set your camera to get a meter reading for. So what are we looking at in this meter? Well, you've got your plus on the one side, you've got your minus on the other, and if you line it up in the middle, that's technically, well, theoretically a proper exposure. Now, as we move into shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, the exposure triangle, we're going to show you how you can cheat that, how you can change what's going on with the camera. So the three different modes. You've got the mode that takes a reading for everything. Some cameras call it matrix, and what it's doing is taking a reading for the brightest part, the darkest part of the scene, and giving you the average and basically putting exposure right in the middle. It's not always going to be right, but it's a good starting point. It's where I've started in the past as a great part to look at. You have then center weighted mode, which is going to be right in the middle, and then you've got something called spot metering, which is going to give you a very small spot reading on just a small section of the image to give you an exposure that you're looking for. So it's gonna give you the plus, the minus, right in the middle where you're looking for it, and that's the theoretical starting point for you guys to go with. So let's move into define each of those modes. Now we're looking at matrix metering. And basically, we're taking a reading of 100% of the scene, and that takes a reading from everything that is in the scene. So it's going to take the brightest thing, it's going to take the darkest thing, and then it's going to give you the average of the whole scene, and that's what it's going to tell you should be the proper exposure. Now, this is pretty much a catch-all. It's a good place to start, and it's a place I started when I started shooting photos, is right here in matrix metering, because that gave me a really good representation of what the scene would look like. Now, it's not always going to be the best mode to choose, because if you have something bright in the background and a subject, so you have something backlit, and that means that it's very bright light coming in from behind you, this mode may not be the best one to use because it's taking that reading from the sky and it's not really taking that person who's sitting right here into as much consideration, because if I'm 10% of the scene and the background is 90% of the scene, it's going to read mostly for the background. So matrix is a good place to go, but it's not always the best. And as we move into all the different types of exposures and the shutter speeds and how everything works, we'll explain how you can tweak here and tweak there to get the proper exposure. So let's move into the next mode. So now we're looking at the center weighted metering mode. Where is this mode good, or what is it? Well, first off, what is it? Where in Matrix you had 100% coverage of the scene, meaning you were getting a reading from 100% of the scene, everything dark, everything light. Center weighted is only going to take a smaller portion, so maybe we'll say 50% of the scene is now going to be red. So if you had something really bright in the background, and we're now just reading myself here, it's going to get a meter reading that's more representative of just me, but not the background. So depending on, this is where focus points come into play. We're going to get into more detail about focus points in the future, but if you have a smaller section, wherever your focus point is, that's where you're going to get the reading for your meter from. So in this case, we're going to put the meter right on me, especially if the background is strong light, strong backlight, because we want the meter to be on me. So if we have the focus point right here, the center weight is where we're going to get our general reading from. Now, it's not something that I use all of the time, but if you want to get a general reading for, say, a half of the scene, and half of the scene is bright, half of the scene is dark, and you just want to get that dark portion, then move that focusing point over so that you can get a reading just for center weighted. So now let's move into spot metering. Now here's one of the third metering modes, and it's a mode that I use a lot, especially when, shooting portraits or shooting concert situations. What's the mode? Spot metering. Where with the other modes you had either 100% coverage, you had 50% coverage. Now we're getting into a very small portion of the frame is where the exposure is being selected from. So this is where the focus point does come into play. For spot metering, whatever is in that really small dot is what the exposure is going to be set upon. So you want to move that, you want to move your focusing point around to the point that you want to get your reading from. So for example, if we have a really bright background and I'm sitting here and you're doing a portrait, well, we would put the dot somewhere here on my face and it would give me the meter reading for myself and not the background. Another example is if you're shooting, say, a concert or something with really bright lights in the sky, in the ceiling or whatever you're shooting. If you were in, say, matrix mode, you would get a reading for everything. But in spot metering mode, you could focus right in on the act and get the exposure right for them instead of seeing the exposure that would have been for all of the lights. So spot metering is really good when you want to get a more defined and a pinpointed exposure for something that you're shooting. So what we had here, we had the matrix metering was 100%. The center weighted was more like 50%. Now, and then spot metering is even smaller. It's like 8%. I know you can change it a little bit. It's like 8% of the scene. So if you put that right where you want it, it's going to give you that theoretical exposure that it thinks you should start with. So now let's move on to show you guys some examples. All right, now that we've talked about all of the three different metering modes, we've got matrix, we've got the center weighted, and we have spot. I want to use this pole with a strong backlight. Remember how I talked about really strong backlight coming in from behind that could mess with your meter? Well, let's start taking pictures of the pole. We're going to start in spot metering mode. Keep in mind, when you're in spot metering, where you move your focusing point is where you will get your exposure from. So right now, we're going to get the exposure right here for the pole. So let me take that. So I can see the image. It was taken at 1/60th of a second. So what I see here is like the background is really blown out. It's really bright. But the pole, I can see the detail in this side of the pole. It's in the shadow area. Now that's not always going to be the best for you because the backlight is so strong. Now, without getting into advanced techniques and talking about other types of things that you can do like flash photography, we're going to just say that the best thing to do if you have strong backlight for this and you see a washed out image, then a good thing to do is just to move move your angle, move your subject, have them change where they're standing so they don't have that strong backlight. Strong backlight is really an interesting thing because it makes for lack of contrast in your images. You get this halo glowing look, and that's not the best thing always to have in your images. Now we're moving into the matrix metering mode, which when I take a picture here is going to read for the pole, it's going to read for the background, it's going to take the average setting and give us what the camera thinks it should be. So boom. So now I can see that the shutter speed went from 1/60th of a second, which is slower, to 1/200th of a second. So that means that this detail that's on the shadow side of the pole isn't filling in as much. So the pole is darker than before. Now we're on to center weighted. Keep in mind that center weighted is tied in just to the middle. It's not going to move when you change your focusing point. It's just going to stay right in the middle of the frame, giving you a reading. So in this case, it may not give me just what the pole see or what I see when shooting the pole. It's going to go around it. So let's see. We can see that the pole is almost we can't see too much of the pole because most of the detail is gone and we're at 1/500th of a second. That's because the center weighted portion of the meter was reading for down the street and kind of seeing the sky and everything in the background, which bumped my shutter speed up, making it seem that it's a brighter scene. So now I don't even have detail in the pole, which is what we were going for. So really, we ran through that. We had the spot metering, we had the matrix metering, and we had the center weighted. And depending on what you're shooting, I feel that the best image here was the matrix metering. It gave the best average of what we were looking at in the scene. I still had detail in the pole, and I still had detail in the background. So for me, that one seemed to work the best. The one that worked the not so well, I think, is the center weighted metering. So center weighted, I try to stay away from. Spot metering looked okay because we had detail in the pole, but it was very blown out. And there are ways that we can make changes from there, and that's why we will do this again when it comes to the exposure triangle to show you how we can get the exposure to change just by tweaking a few things. So let's move on. So I just thought of something that would be really good to mention to you guys, that your focal length is actually going to affect your metering. And what I mean by that is when you're shooting ultra wide, say you're in that matrix mode, the one that sees 100% of your scene, as you're ultra wide, you're seeing the sky, you're seeing the ground, you're seeing everything in between. So that's what your meter is seeing. But as you zoom in, your field of view is narrowing, so the sensors, your meter's not seeing as much. It's not picking up the sky. It's not picking up the ground. It may just be picking out what is right in front of you. So it's going to give you a reading for what is in front of you. So keep in mind that as you zoom, your metering is going to be affected by that. So that's something just to think about when you're out there shooting. One of the most important things in photography is getting your focus right. Because if your photo isn't tack sharp, and you're going to hear me say tack sharp a lot, then it's probably not a keeper. And I'll tell you that when I am shooting, that if my image isn't tack sharp and it's slightly out, if I know that it's slightly out, it's not getting kept because I do not want to deliver that product to my clients. You should get into the mentality of thinking that I want to get every image tack sharp as much as possible. So how are we going to do that? Well, there's different focusing modes. You've got manual focus, you've got continuous focus, you have single focus, and you even have this full-on autofocus thing that the camera lets you do, which I'm going to explain as we move on. But I want you to remember this. You want to have tack sharp images, and the ways to do that are selecting the right focusing modes. So let's talk about those right now. So let's look at manually focusing your lens to get a sharp image. What this means is that you literally have to focus the lens yourself to see if you can get a tack sharp image. It's not the easiest thing to do. It's not something you want to really do when you're shooting action, because fast moving action isn't very easy to keep up with when you're manually focusing your lens. Back in the day before we had autofocus, that's what you had to do. You had to select, you had to sit here and try to follow focus and capture the subject. There's something else you could do. You could literally find a place to focus, set it right there, and wait for the action to hit it. But that's pretty limiting on what you're looking to do. Now, there's something in the camera that helps you know when you're actually in focus. Now, when you're looking through the camera, there's actually an indicator for this. In most of your cameras, in most new cameras, there's a focus indicator, it's a focus indicator that you'll see a solid dot show up when the image is pretty close to focus or right in focus. Once you see that dot, then you can shoot the picture. Now, it's not easy because now you're not looking at your composition, you're not looking at your image, and you may miss the subject if they end up moving. So that says that manually focus is best done with subjects that aren't moving. So if you're shooting a still life or you're doing a macro shot, just remember that it's not that easy to get your focus tack sharp when you're doing it manually, especially if you don't have good eyes like me. So let's move into some of those autofocus modes. Now let's look at continuous focus. This is one of the main modes that you're going to use most often. Now, continuous focus means that you are going to continuously focus on your subject as long as your finger is pressed halfway down on the button. Most cameras let you hold the shutter button halfway down to get you to activate your continuous focus. Some cameras even have the ability to let you use a back button to get continuous focus. I personally use the shutter button to allow me to do that because that's what I am most comfortable with at this point. Now, continuous focus is great for shooting subjects that are always moving. So for sports, a subject that's going from the left of the frame to the right of the frame and up and forward and back, you're going to want to focus track them. And that brings up something interesting as well. You have focusing points inside your camera that are going to move around. You can move them around by using your joystick or a dial. There's a dial in the back. On some of the other cameras, you can just switch around to get the right focusing point. Some cameras have 6, some cameras have 51, but wherever you're at, you can select those focusing points. This comes into play when you want to track a subject because there's single focus points and then there's dynamic focus points. And what that means is in single focus points, if somebody's going to run across the screen and they're going to jump from the center focus point to the left focus point, you want to be able to track them. In single focusing point, you're going to focus on them, and if they jump outside of that point, it's no longer going to continuously track them. That's where dynamic comes into play. Dynamic focus will track that subject no matter where they go in your frame. So you want to be careful with continuous focus as well. There are points where it's not a good mode to be in, and that's if you're shooting a static subject, a subject that isn't moving. For example, a portrait where you have to recompose your image. So in shooting a portrait, I like to lock my focus in and then recompose to get a better composition. If you're in continuous focus and you say you lock in on the eye because the eye is the most important, and then you move your camera, what's going to happen? The autofocus is going to shift, and that's not a good thing. You don't want the focus to shift because then you won't have tack sharp images. But how do we make sure that the focus isn't going to shift? Well, let's move right into the next focusing mode. So here we are to talk about single focus. Now, in continuous, the focus kept going. No matter, as long as your finger was pressed halfway down on the button, it kept going. With single focus, you have the ability to lock your focus in where you want it, and then if you move away from the subject, the focus isn't going to shift. But that brings up some other concerns. But before I get to those concerns, I like to put on the focus beep in my camera. Most cameras allow you to do this. What this means is if I'm going to focus in on the wall here, and I find a place to focus, I press the button halfway down, I hear a beep. That beep lets me know that I'm now in focus. But if I shift and I move things like this, or I change my zoom, I zoom in, I zoom out, well, the focus isn't going to be the same place as when I started. So you want to recompose. Every time you recompose or zoom, you want to refocus. So I'm going to re-lock in now, and that tells me that I'm in focus. I like hearing the beep because it gives me that audible approval that yes, you are in focus, because being tack sharp is one of the most important things for me. So single focus, best time to use this is when you're shooting portraits, when you're shooting still lives and things that aren't moving, because you can lock in right where you want, recompose ever so slightly. If you're going to do massive recompositions, then you're going to want to refocus. You could also use your focusing points to move it to, say, the eye, or to move it to the right side of the frame for your composition, or the left side of the frame for your composition. So you have that ability too. But it's good to lock in, hear that beep, and then make sure your focus is tack sharp. So single focus is a really good thing to use when the subjects aren't moving. Now, there is a way that you can actually shoot fast-moving action, and that's called pre-focusing. You can select a spot that you want to get the focus where you know the action is going to happen, and then you can pre-focus there, and when the action gets there, you can take that picture. Now, for example, if you have a motocross, you're shooting motocross and there's a jump, you can pre-focus on that jump because you know that's where the action is going to happen. So when you pre-focus, you're going to lock in right on that jump. And when the subject comes by, boom, you're going to take that picture. You have a better chance of capturing them that way than trying to get that autofocus to engage in a split second where the subject moves in and then moves out. That's where pre-focusing comes in handy. And there is a way to make sure by using your aperture properly, which we'll talk about in the exposure triangle, that if you have a higher aperture like f8 or something like that, you're giving yourself a little bit more leeway. You have a little bit more play with your focus because you have a deeper depth of field. You have the ability to get that motocross jumper in focus, whether they're, whether they hit the spot where you pre-focused or they're a little further back or a little further forward. But we'll talk about that as we move into the exposure triangle. So there you go with single focus. In a lot of beginner cameras, you're going to find that there's now a mode that will automatically select whether you're going to be in continuous focus or single focus. I do not recommend ever leaving this auto mode on. The only time I would go into that mode is if you want to hand your camera to a friend and they don't understand how to use your camera, then I would tell you to put it in that auto mode so that it will select the proper focus in that situation. But for your everyday shooting, you should be deciding whether you should be in continuous, single, or manual. You need to make those decisions because it's about getting those tack sharp images. You just have to ask yourself the question, what am I photographing? Is it fast moving action? Is it something that's still and not moving? You have to decide, should I be in single? Should I be in continuous? Or should I be in manual focus? So keep those in your mind as we move forward on to the next thing. I called both of you here to tell you one thing, that I'm better. And the reason that I'm better than you, ISO, is because without me slowing down, we gotta bump you way too high, and then you get some noise and all of that bad stuff like that. We don't need that. That's why I'm more important than you. And you over there, aperture, yeah, you need me more than I need you because you need to let in a lot of light. And if you don't let in enough light, then you gotta slow me down, which then could try to make me look bad. It's just not gonna happen. You're not gonna make me look bad. I'm better than you, man. You know what? Without ISO, your shutter speed doesn't mean anything because you can't bump it up. Because when I go higher, you get higher. Let's get high. I want to get higher. Let's take it higher because you need me more than I need you. That's why I am better than you. And you over here, Mr. Aperture, if you aren't good enough and you can't open up wide enough, you got to bump me higher just as well to get better photos. You know what? If I don't let in more light, you are going to get all grainy and you're not going to look good because we got to bump you up higher. And you over there, without me, your shutter speed's way too slow and you just get blurry. Do we want blurry pictures? No. We want tack sharp pictures. Remember that. Blurry. You know what? Insanity just rings. You're clueless. No matter how many 40-year-old women you try to be, still better than you. If you don't get it by now, I don't know what I'm going to do to make you get it. You don't understand. You don't understand. And you both need me. Stop. You're all important. We all need to work together in order to get this right. Shutter speed, ISO, aperture. We need to work together in order to get great pictures. We're in this together. So you know what? Let's go outside and make this happen. Let's go. So here we go. We're in an outside situation, and I have to figure out what is the proper exposure for this. So the first thing that I'm looking at right now is that it's pretty overcast. So what am I thinking that I have to do? Well, I need an ISO that's going to let in a good amount of light because it's not really, really bright. I also know that my subject isn't moving. She's not going to be jumping around and dancing in this scene. So I know that my shutter speed doesn't have to be really, really high in order to freeze motion. The other thing is my aperture. So we're going to play with that as we see what the settings could be. So I'm just going to do a quick guess here. I'm going to set my ISO somewhere around, I'm going to say 800 ISO. And the reason I'm doing that is because that's a little bit high because we're not in bright daylight, but it's good for something that we're in for overcast. I'm just going to guess here that I should shoot around 1/100th of a second. and I'm going to be at f4. So let's see how this actually works. I am also going to go into single focus mode because she's not moving, and I can lock in right on her. So I'm just going to do this test shot. There you go. What's interesting about this is that I've actually gotten it pretty darn close. My settings are right on. This brings up something that I would like you guys to do. Go into situations and guess your settings, because what's going to happen? We're going to guess our setting, and then we're going to, you're going to get a base setting. And what I'm going to go back and do now is I'm going to get it totally wrong and explain how we can make it right and fix it. I'm going to start at 200 ISO. So that's really meant for a bright day. I'm going to leave my shutter speed at 1/100th of a second, and I'm going to leave my aperture at f4. But the only thing I changed here was my ISO, so that's part of the triangle. It's not letting in a lot of light. Now let's see what happens. All right, Jerry. And I take a look at it. And now that I see it, it's really, really dark. It's too dark to even be used. I can barely see the image. So what do we do from here? How do we make corrections? Now let's look at the triangle. What can we do to get more light? Well, we could raise that ISO up. It started at 200. We could take it up to somewhere else. How else can we get more light? We can take our f-stop and make it a lower number, meaning we're going to make that opening wider in the lens, and that's going to let more light in. But right now we're at f4, and most of the lenses that a lot of beginners have won't go below that. So the other option I have is shutter speed. I can slow it down. So here are some concerns when you slow the shutter speed down. If you make it too slow and you use a longer lens, you have a chance of getting some motion blur going in there because you can't handhold at certain speeds. Let's first change our ISO. We started at 200, and that didn't look so good because it's too dark. So we want to let more light in. I'm going to raise it up to 400 and see what happens now. So let's go do the same picture. Here we go. Oh, that looks great, of course. Lock my focus in on 3, 1, 2, 3. We basically did the same photo. It's a little brighter. We're starting to get some light. We're starting to figure this out. So we know that by raising our ISO, we're letting more light in this particular situation that we're at. But what you want to be careful about is not putting your ISO up way too high. The higher you go, you start to introducing more noise and more grain. And that may work in certain situations, but it certainly doesn't work in all. So I'm going to take this back up to 800 ISO because I want to let more light in and see what we've got from there. So here we go. Same thing, Jerry. Lock it in, take the shot, check it out, and that is much, much better. Now we're getting there. You see what we're doing here? We're just checking our settings. We're going from one setting to the next setting and seeing what works. It's that cause and effect. That's what photography is all about. It's about playing with the settings until you start to understand them fully so that you know that if I change this, this is what's going to happen. If I move that, that's what's going to happen. So this shot, based on the screen and what I'm looking at, is looking pretty good. I may want to make it a little more bright. So I want to let a little bit more light in. So this time, instead of raising the ISO, I'm going to slow my shutter speed down just a little bit. I'm going to go from 100th of a second to say 60th of a second and see how this works. You doing all right, Jer? All right. Boom. And it's starting to look pretty good. But you know what? I kind of liked it at 100th, between a 60th of a second and 100th of a second. 80th looked pretty good. So I've just figured out my lighting situation in a matter of 3 or 4 pictures. I was able to go, all right, I started at 200 ISO, and that wasn't enough. I needed to let more light in. So I just went through how to let more light in. We changed the ISO. We raised it up. We lowered our shutter speed a little bit, and we didn't even touch the aperture in this case because we didn't have the ability to let more light in there. So now I can really go ahead and do a couple of photos now that I've gotten it right at 80th of a second at f4 at about 800 ISO. That's a pretty good place. So let's move on to doing that. All right, Jerry, you ready? We're just going to keep looking right here. This is good. This is perfect. I'm going to lock in right on your eye. Yeah, I mean, the light keeps changing, and as the light changes, you have to figure out what are you going to do. So it feels like it got a little darker, so we need to let more light in. So what I'm going to do quickly is I'm going to bump my ISO up to 1,000 at this point, and I'm going to leave my shutter speed at 1/80th of a second because I needed more light to come in because it got a little darker just in a couple of seconds. It keeps changing. So here we go. All right, perfect. There we go, very nice. So you always have to constantly watch for light changing because as light changes, you have to make changes to your exposure. This way, Jerry, that's perfect again. It's kind of like a natural at this. Smiles, look at that. Hold still, you can smile, that's good. Locking in, boom, I got that. That's really nice. Really, really nice. And let's keep moving over to the side. Yep. That's perfect again. Now, I want to check my light here. Basically, what's going on over here is that I'm on a shadowy side, so I need to let more light in again. I need to compensate. So I'm going to just drop my shutter speed from 1/80th of a second back to 1/60th of a second, and that's going to let a little bit more light in because there's a little bit more shadow on this side of her face. There we go. That looks good. Yep. And there we go. That let a good amount of light in. I made the right corrections there. Maybe a little tweak here and there would be better. Just a quick bump. I'm going to go to 1/80th of a second now just to play with this. Here we go. Let's go vertical. Got it. Really nice. So let me just show you what we're looking at.
Oh, that's nice. Good job.
Thank you. I try. I really try. That's really a quick way to do a shoot and just react to the situation that you're in. Lighting is always going to change. It's not a constant unless you have continuous lights on inside, like a light bulb that's going to be the same brightness at all times. When you're outside, there's a lot of variables. Things change, and you have to react to that. And that's why the exposure triangle is really important. You just have to figure out, if I make this change, this is what's going to happen. Or if the light changes, what do I have to do in order to do this? So I can't explain everything to you perfectly for every situation, but it just comes down to being out there, making those quick changes while you're there, and just seeing what's going to happen. So we're going to do a little bit more of that. So you saw us try to figure out the triangle by changing the ISO. We started at 200 and ended up at 800. Now what would happen if we started at 800 and wanted to come into this situation to figure out the proper shutter speed? Let's go and do that. So we're going to start the shutter speed at something like 1/20th of a second. And remember, that's really slow. If you think back to when we were at the playground, that the shutter was really slow. The slower the sound, that also means the slower the shutter is going to be. So we're going to see what's going to happen here. I'm going to tell you it's going to probably let in a lot of light because 1/20th of a second is pretty slow. That means the shutter is staying open longer, letting more light in. So what I'm going to do is run through from 1/20th of a second, and I'm going to hit it all the way up to maybe 250th, 320th of a second just to see what's going to happen. The cause and effect. Remember, cause and effect. Jerry, you ready? Here we go. There's 1/20th, and I can feel it was really slow, and I can see that it's really bright. Her face is really bright. So let's take it to 1/40th of a second. Boom. Let's go to 1/60th of a second. Boom. Let's take it to 1/25th. Another, and then we'll go up to 250th and stop right there. So there we have that, and basically what's going on here is the opposite of what happened with the ISO. When we were with a really low number ISO, the picture looked really dark. As we got to a higher shutter speed, the same thing was happening. Because what's going on as you raise your shutter speed? It's not letting as much light in. Remember, we're not in a very bright situation right now. So when there's not a lot of light, your shutter speed has to be slower. So in this case, at 2/50th of a second, it wasn't cutting it. You were almost unable to see it, and that's not good. You want to be able to see the image, obviously, to get a good picture. So we have to go and make it lower. 1/20th of a second was too bright, 2/50th of a second was too dark. Somewhere in between there would probably be the right place to be. So remember, cause and effect. Just play around, see what's going to happen. Get into that situation, guess the settings, and then try to figure out where you should be from there. So now we want to try and capture some action going on. So what do we have to think about with the exposure triangle to get action, to freeze a subject? Well, with the portrait, we had a slow shutter speed because Jerry wasn't moving. She wasn't doing anything other than just standing there and smiling and looking good, because that's what she does. But when it comes to dancing and moving and spinning around, that's fast-moving action. What do we need to do that's different from a portrait? Well, if you remember, the shutter speed was slow over there. We have to make it go faster. So how can we make the shutter speed go faster? What do we have to do in the same lighting situation as we were before to basically freeze action? Well, we need to bump the shutter speed up. So beyond raising that higher, we need to let more light in. How are we going to let more light in? We have to raise the ISO. That's one way to do it. As the ISO goes up, we're able to raise the shutter speed up to help capture motion. The reason we're going higher up is because we need a faster shutter speed. For example, something like 1/1000th of a second, just like we did out in the park with the swing going by, we were able to stop that motion in its tracks. We want to do the same thing here with Jerry when she's dancing and spinning around, so we've raised our ISO. That allows us more light so that we can compensate with a faster shutter speed. What's another way we could let more light in? Well, if for example, our f-stop or our aperture was somewhere at like f8, we could then lower that to f5.6, f4. We could open it up. We just need to let more light in. So get into that thinking that to freeze action, you need to let more light in order to give yourself a faster shutter speed. Because when it's faster, you're going to freeze that action. So just keep remembering that. It's a cause and effect. Everything in the triangle is going to affect something else. You could change two things in the triangle to basically attain one goal. And that's what we've done here. We needed to get a faster shutter speed, so we've let more light in by opening up the aperture, and then we've let more light in by raising the ISO. So here we go. Let's try to get this action of Jerry dancing around here and see what we can do with the shutter speeds. All right, let me grab that. Thank you. We're going to start with the same shutter speed that we had for when we were shooting the portrait and see what happens. Okay, go ahead. All right, hold it. And I can see what's going on. There's motion. There's movement. She is not frozen, and I want her to be frozen right there in the picture. Instead, I can see everything spinning around. So what do I need to do? I need to raise my shutter speed. So let me just get my exposure to where I think it should be to freeze this action out here in its tracks. All right, Jerry, go ahead. All right, thank you. And that is much better. At a much higher shutter speed, I was able to freeze the action. The hair is frozen as she's spinning. Her jacket isn't moving. It's solid. Everything about her is frozen in time, more so than when I was at a slower shutter speed. So the slower speed caused that motion blur to go on. We were able to raise it up and use a faster shutter speed because we know how to use this exposure triangle. We know how to compensate for that by letting more light in. When you let more light in, you can then have a faster shutter speed. So let's move on from there and keep going. We've been through a lot. We've covered so many things. And with photography, you're never going to stop learning. So always just have your mindset that, you know what, I'm going to always be learning as I grow. And just remember that this isn't the end-all and be-all of all the information that's out there. You really have to practice, and you really have to try a lot of this stuff on your own, because you can only learn so much from a book. What it comes down to is getting out there in the field and just trying things and shooting and learning. It's a good thing to know what you're doing and you think that you've mastered one part of photography. Well, that's great. But you know what? Don't rest on your laurels. Don't fall back on just that one thing that you know. It's good to just try new things. If you're not good at one type of photography, say you're good at action, but you're not good at portraits. Well, maybe you should focus in on learning how to do portraits, because you never know when somebody's going to call you and say, hey, I need some portraits taken, and you really don't want to turn down those jobs if you're trying to make some money to further yourself as a photographer. We've talked about the exposure triangle. We've talked about shutter speeds and how everything works together. The best way to continue to learn this stuff is to go out there and do it. And I know that you guys can be successful at this. Anybody can learn this. It's just some people are going to learn at a slower pace and some people are going to pick it up much quicker. But it really comes down to just trying this stuff out. You can fall into a thing called paralysis of analysis. And what that means is that you just worry too much. You sit in front of your computer and not going and shooting. Because you know what happens, and it happens to me. The longer I sit in front of my computer and just look at photos and analyze and think about what gear should I get, or should I get this lens, should I do this, should I do that? If you just sit around doing that stuff and you don't actually go out and shoot, you're really not doing yourself any favors. It really comes down to getting out and shooting, because the only way to learn this stuff is by doing. So this book is a starting point for you. You know, it's giving you the basics, but I can't give you everything. I can't spoon feed it all to you, because there's a lot that you have to do to form your own style. There's a lot of learning that goes into this. It's a lot of trial and error. So the best advice that I can give you guys is get out there and shoot. Challenge yourself to try new things, and don't get stuck in that rut where you're like, no, I'm only this type of photographer. This is all I shoot. Because if you get stuck saying this is all I shoot and somebody comes along and says, hey, can you do this job? I really need this. Well, you're not going to be able to do it. You're not going to master everything, but if you can cover learning and trying new things, that's really going to help you out. Remember, composition is really important. Study other books, study magazines, study photos online, study the movies. This is an art form. Photography is all about art. Just get out there and shoot. And if you find yourself in a rut, just, take yourself out there and just go shoot for fun. Because I find that if it becomes too much business and you're worried too much about this and that and the fun has gone away, well, you know what? I just pick up my camera and I go shoot something that was fun. And there's no stress, there's no pressure. I just go out there and I do it. And you know what? I have a lot of fun just going out and shooting photos and not thinking too much. Seeing it, going out and doing it and trying it for yourself to see what works and then learning from there. So really, just enjoy photography. You can make this a profession if that's the direction you want to go. Or you could just be a great photographer who loves getting photos of their kids and their family so that you have things to pass on through the years. This is a lot of fun. Photography is great. It can take you all around the world. It's taken me all around the world. So really, just get out there and shoot. Get out there and shoot. Keep learning. Go from there. Don't overanalyze things. Just keep shooting. Have fun. And that's where we're going to wrap it up. Jared Poland, FroKnowsPhoto.com. See ya.